Hello everyone, and welcome to the Watcher's Desk channel. If you're new here, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button to join our community. Today we're diving into a discussion about the movie Five Nights at Freddy's 2, slated for release in 2025. The flickering fluorescent lights of the newly renovated Freddy Fazbear's Pizza hummed with an unsettling energy. Jeremy Fitzgerald, a young man whose previous employment history included a brief, ill-fated stint as a motivational speaker for a struggling network marketing firm, a venture that ended abruptly after an incident involving a trampoline and a very angry regional manager, took the night shift. He needed the money. His aspirations of becoming a concept artist for indie video games were currently being funded by instant ramen and sheer willpower. The pizzeria was different now. The old animatronics were gone, replaced by a new, shinier, and somehow even more terrifying lineup. There was Toy Freddy, whose plastic eyes seemed a fraction too wide, and Toy Bonnie, whose guitar playing, even in its dormant state, suggested a surprisingly complex understanding of minor chords. Then there was Mangle, a partially disassembled monstrosity hanging from the ceiling wires like a grotesque modern art installation. A testament, perhaps, to corporate cost-cutting measures gone horribly awry. The guardroom offered meager protection. Instead of traditional doors, Jeremy had access to a central security monitor and a mandatory flashlight. Crucially, he was given a complimentary Freddy Fazbear mask, a heavy fiberglass relic that was supposed to fool the older, more worn-out units, the withered ones, remnants of the previous location, who occasionally wandered in from the back rooms, their movements jerky and unnatural, like stop-motion figures brought to life by a vengeful spirit. The first few nights were a baptism by fire. The phone calls from the previous night guard, a character whose frantic, gasping instructions hinted at a long and traumatic history with these machines, were overwhelming. Jeremy learned quickly that the key was managing power. The flashlight burned through the limited battery supply, and the mask offered a temporary reprieve but consumed energy just by being worn. He remembered his college days, pulling all-nighters fueled by caffeine and adrenaline, desperately trying to meet deadlines for architectural design projects. This felt much worse. Less about a failing grade and more about imminent violent disassembly. The toy animatronics were relentless, driven by sophisticated movement algorithms. Toy Chica, whose appetite for maintenance seemed matched only by her appetite for destruction, would pace just outside the camera view, her yellow form occasionally catching the edge of the monitor. Jeremy found himself using the audio lure function, playing a pre-recorded jingle in a distant room, a desperate attempt to redirect their programmed focus, much like he used to distract his irritable landlord with poorly timed pizza deliveries. One particularly harrowing night, the older units made their move. Withered Foxy, surprisingly fast for something held together with exposed wires and sheer malice, rushed the left vent. Jeremy slammed the vent cover shut just as the metallic snout collided with the plastic, the impact rattling his teeth. He spared a moment to consider Foxy's original programming, a friendly pirate attraction, and how profoundly that purpose had been twisted into something predatory. The mystery deepened as the week progressed. Jeremy uncovered snippets of old maintenance logs suggesting that the new toy models weren't just new casings. They contained advanced facial recognition software designed to identify staff members specifically. This explained the chilling moment when Toy Bonnie had briefly paused, his head tilted, seemingly trying to place Jeremy's face. By the final shift, exhaustion was his constant companion. The power kept dipping dangerously low. Mangle dropped down from the ceiling unexpectedly, a chaotic tangle of wires and sharp edges, forcing Jeremy to scramble for the mask while simultaneously trying to reboot the ventilation system. When he finally donned the mask, the cold, hard plastic pressed against his face, and for a terrifying minute, the whirring and clicking ceased. He could hear only his own ragged breathing mingling with the faint, high-pitched electronic whine emanating from the figure mere inches away. As dawn approached, painting the grime-streaked windows a pale, hopeful gray, the sounds faded. The animatronics retreated, their artificial malice momentarily subdued by the rising sun. Jeremy slumped back in his chair, the stale air thick with ozone and fear. He survived the week, earning his small paycheck, but the experience left an indelible mark. He understood now that the real horror wasn't just being hunted. It was the uncanny valley, the near-human quality of the threat, the mechanical mimicry of life that sought to extinguish his own. He walked out into the morning light, his mind already drafting concept sketches, not of fantastical creatures, but of empty, silent security rooms. The thin veneer of hope Jeremy clung to during those pre-dawn hours evaporated as soon as he clocked in for the next inevitable shift. He noticed subtle changes now, shifts in the environment that his exhausted mind initially dismissed as hallucinations brought on by sleep deprivation. The way Toy Chica's painted eyes seemed slightly more focused on the camera feed, or how the static on the monitor briefly resolved itself into what looked unnervingly like an actual image before dissolving back into noise. He carried the weight of the previous night's close calls, the phantom smell of burning circuits and the phantom pressure of Foxy's impact lingered. Jeremy, who prided himself on his meticulous planning, found his methods useless against an enemy that defied logic. His attempts to apply efficiency metrics, the kind he'd once used to optimize workflow for those disastrous network marketing seminars, failed miserably here. You couldn't schedule an animatronic attack. The calls from the supervisor, phone guy, were growing less instructional and more desperate. The voice, once booming with manufactured enthusiasm, was now tight, strained, clearly on the verge of breaking. He described the new safety protocols with an alarming lack of conviction, hinting at corporate mandates that prioritized the attraction's integrity over the guard's well-being. It reminded Jeremy of the fine print in those multi-level marketing contracts, all promise and no protection. The withered units, particularly withered Bonnie, became his primary psychological tormentors. Unlike the smooth, predictable patrols of the toys, Bonnie moved with a terrifying, almost human randomness. He didn't just walk, he seemed to lurch, his exposed endoskeleton clicking like malformed castanets. One night, as Jeremy peeked through the camera, showing the parts and service room, he saw Bonnie standing utterly still, one hand raised, seeming to conduct an invisible orchestra of dread. It was a pose so deliberately theatrical that Jeremy felt a wave of nausea, realizing this wasn't just faulty programming. There was intent, a dark, perverse artistry behind the malfunctions. The mask became a necessary evil, a suffocating blanket of fiberglass that bought time but cost energy and sanity. When wearing it, Jeremy felt a shift in perception. The world narrowed to the sound of his own heartbeat echoing against the plastic shell. He could almost sense the toys adjusting their own internal chronometers, waiting patiently for the signal that the disguise was no longer effective. He thought of his mother, a pragmatic woman who worked double shifts as a nurse, always telling him, if you can't fix it, at least survive it. Survival here felt like a temporary state, a brief reprieve between rounds. Mangala remained the most unpredictable element. Sometimes it would hang silently for hours, a victim of its own tangled existence. Other times, it would descend with startling speed, its mangled faceplate inches from the ceiling vent, emitting a screech that sounded like 1,000 dial-up modems dying at once. The noise wasn't just auditory torture. It seemed to actively interfere with the security system, causing localized brownouts on the monitor feeds. As the week bled into the final longest night, Jeremy stopped trying to strategize and defaulted entirely to reaction. Power management became a grim calculation. One light burst, 3 seconds of mask usage, no more than 2 audio lures. He felt himself shedding his past self, the hopeful artist, the failed motivational speaker, becoming something leaner, purely reactive. He was an organic alarm system fighting against clockwork demons. The air in the small office grew cold, not just from the failing ventilation, but from the sheer absence of living warmth in the building. He looked at the monitor showing the prize corner, where the new, unnervingly cheerful Puppet, stood encased in its box. It hadn't moved all week, yet its presence felt heavier than all the others combined, an unblinking promise of something truly eternal and dark lurking beneath the surface of the colorful facade. When the first rays of the sun finally touched the horizon, signaling the end of his contract, Jeremy didn't feel relief. He felt an immense, heavy vacancy, as if the adrenaline had been replaced by cold, inert metal. He left the mask on the desk, its face staring blankly at the empty hallway, not looking back at the place where his career almost became his tomb. The silence that followed his final exit was louder than any electronic shriek he had endured. Jeremy walked out into the indifferent morning, his shoulders slumped under the unseen weight of the week's trauma. The light felt too sharp, the sounds of normal traffic too jarring after the carefully controlled, claustrophobic sounds of the pizzeria. He was technically solvent, having earned the requisite funds, but the exchange rate had been his own sense of equilibrium. He tossed the complimentary employee badge into a nearby public trash receptacle, a small, satisfying act of severance. His hands still faintly trembled, a residual motor function tic that he knew would plague him for weeks, mimicking the jittery movements of the withered bots. The memory of Withered Foxy's charge was particularly vivid. He could still feel the phantom vibration against the metal vent cover, a visceral reminder of how close he'd come to being breached. As he walked further away, the narrative of the restaurant seemed to replay in his mind, not as a sequence of events, but as a series of terrifying portraits. He pictured toy Freddy, not just standing guard, but absorbing information, his wide, vacant eyes acting as sophisticated, unblinking surveillance lenses. It was the cold intelligence of these newer models that truly unsettled him. They weren't simply malfunctioning remnants of a tragic past. They were the future of calculated hostility. Jeremy thought briefly of the unnamed security guard who had called him, the one whose voice cracked with unspeakable history. He realized now that the previous guard hadn't been offering advice. He'd been sharing warnings about inevitable patterns, an oral history passed down through the meager channels of an understaffed, deeply compromised operation. That man had likely walked out of here broken, just as Jeremy now felt creatively and emotionally hollowed out. He recalled the parts and service room, glimpsed only briefly on camera 3. The sheer anatomy of the animatronics, stripped down and awaiting deployment, was horrific. They weren't toys. They were exoskeletons designed for adult-sized infiltration. Seeing withered Bonnie there, half dismantled yet somehow expectant, struck Jeremy as the ultimate artistic statement on obsolescence, a machine refusing to accept its retirement, instead choosing to actively dismantle the living. The experience had ironically clarified his artistic direction. His previous attempts at motivational speaking, trying to inject artificial enthusiasm into failing business models, had been hollow. Now, his art would focus on the grotesque intersection of technology and manufactured joy. He didn't want to draw fantastic beasts anymore. He wanted to draw the precise moment when a cheerful plastic facade cracked to reveal the indifferent mechanism beneath. He stopped at a corner cafe, ordering the strongest coffee available. As he waited, he instinctively checked his peripheral vision, scanning the reflective surfaces of the shop windows for any unnatural movement. He was hypervigilant, a condition he knew was endemic to survivors of such environments. The caffeine hit, but instead of energy, it brought clarity to his fear. He didn't feel like he'd won. He felt like he'd merely been allowed to leave the ring before the final bell. The unsettling part was realizing that the management of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza had not intended for him to survive the week. They had simply set the parameters of the trial, and he had stumbled through the required checkpoints, earning his freedom by default, not by prowess. He took a long sip, the hot liquid a poor substitute for the warmth he realized he was missing, and began planning his next set of sketches, drawings of isolation, darkness, and the haunting silence of automated betrayal. The need for distance became immediate and absolute. Jeremy didn't return to his cramped apartment immediately. The thought of re-entering that small space, surrounded by his unused art supplies and the silence of his solitary existence, felt like inviting the pizzeria's atmosphere to settle permanently around him. Instead, he took a bus across town, heading toward the sprawling, somewhat dilapidated public library, a place synonymous with anonymity and the quiet hum of functioning, non-threatening technology. He found a secluded terminal in the basement archives, the air smelling faintly of old paper and ozone, a much healthier scent than what he had recently breathed. His initial impulse wasn't to find work or even distraction, but to research the corporation behind the establishment. He typed in fragments of overheard phrases from phone guys' increasingly panicked messages, names that sounded like manufacturing subsidiaries, cryptic references to Fazbear Entertainment's continuing legacy. What he unearthed was a labyrinth of shell companies, bankruptcies, and suspiciously settled lawsuits, all orbiting around the same foundational tragedy. It was a corporate hydra, perpetually regenerating its public face while its core remained rooted in hidden failure. This research provided a chilling framework for his art. The animatronics hadn't been random attacks, they were systemic responses. The toys, with their facial recognition, were security protocols gone rogue, designed to eliminate perceived threats to the product, the illusion of safety. The Wizards were the ghosts of the old system, the raw, untamed grief of the facility's past, manifesting as raw aggression. He started sketching right there on a discarded notepad, capturing the cold logic of the toy models, precise lines, perfect angles of attack, the horrifying beauty of efficient malice. This wasn't concept art for a game. It was evidence logged by a traumatized witness. During a brief break, he found himself staring at the library's automated checkout system, a sleek, modern machine that scanned books with soft green lights. He instinctively flinched, half expecting the device to rear up and present him with a utility bill instead of a receipt. The hyper-awareness had transformed mundane technology into potential threats. Every blinking LED, every faint whir of a cooling fan carried the potential for malice. He remembered the precise, practiced articulation of Toy Bonnie's jaw movement when it almost reached him, a movement so fluid it suggested hours of simulated, stress-tested rehearsal. Hours dissolved into the research and sketching. When he finally surfaced, blinking under the harsh artificial light of the main hall, he noticed a small detail on the corner of his last drawing. He had unconsciously rendered the puppet's box from the prize corner. It was drawn with meticulous detail, the subtle grain of the wood, the specific placement of the golden stripes, and on the lid, he had scribbled a tiny, almost invisible inscription he'd never noticed before. A date, circled twice. It wasn't the date of his employment. It was much older, seeming to mark the real genesis of the horror, the point where the entertainment aspect had officially curdled into something else entirely. Jeremy felt a profound sense of vertigo. His 5-night ordeal wasn't the story. It was just the most recent chapter in a cycle that the corporation intended to continue indefinitely, hunting for new bodies to feed the narrative. He closed the notepad, suddenly aware that true safety lay not in escape, but in understanding the depth of the conspiracy he had only just begun to map. The realization that his ordeal was merely a repeating iteration, a cog in an unending corporate cycle, hardened Jeremy's resolve into something cold and calculating, much like the very machines he feared. He left the library not with relief, but with a mission that superseded his need for sleep or security. His former life, the one populated by daydreams of creating immersive worlds, now seemed frivolous. The real world, the terrifyingly real world he had just escaped, demanded documentation. He returned to his apartment, but instead of collapsing, he set up a makeshift workspace. He used his graphics tablet, usually reserved for designing futuristic cityscapes, to scan and catalog the few blurry photographs he'd managed to snap of the pizzeria's interior before his camera functionality was disrupted by Mangle's electrical interference. He needed visual evidence that wasn't tainted by the residue of fear distorting his memory. Jeremy focused intensely on the details of the environmental decay. He zoomed in on the scuff marks near the east vent, marks he now knew were left by withered Bonnie's dragon gate. He recalled how, during the third night, he'd seen a faint, reddish smear near the base of the arcade cabinet, housing 5 nights at Mr. Hippo's arcade. He dismissed it as old soda residue then, but viewed under the detached scrutiny of daylight, it took on a sickening familiarity. He cross-referenced this visual data with the cryptic maintenance logs he'd managed to download before his final shift ended, logs that mentioned unforeseen biomaterial contamination, requiring level 4 deep sterilization. This objective analysis was his new defense mechanism. By dissecting the horror into data points and visual assets, he was reclaiming agency. He felt a kinship, oddly enough, with the engineers who must have designed the early animatronics, people who sought to impose rigid order onto unpredictable organic variables. Only now, Jeremy was applying that rigid order to the chaos that had nearly consumed him. He realized that Phone Guy's desperation wasn't just about survival, it was about impotence. The man hadn't been able to stop the cycle because he was just another employee operating within the established, flawed parameters. Jeremy, however, was now an external observer, a defector armed with first-hand knowledge of the security flaws. One evening, while sifting through digitized newspaper clippings related to the various location closures, Jeremy stumbled upon a photograph from the original pizzeria opening, the one with the older, less sophisticated animatronics. Standing awkwardly near the curtain, looking distinctly out of place in a cheap, ill-fitting suit, was a younger man holding a clipboard with an almost painfully earnest expression. The resemblance to Phone Guy was undeniable, but this man looked hopeful, not broken. This was likely the original security or management supervisor, the man who started the legacy. The contrast between the hopeful novice and the frantic caller Jeremy had heard on the phone line was staggering, a perfect visual representation of the psychological toll the job exacted over time. As he stared at the old photo, the realization hit him. The animatronics weren't the only things being haunted. The very space was contaminated, leaching sanity from anyone forced to occupy it. Jeremy packed his tablet and his notes. He wouldn't be staying in the city. The city was too close to the source. He needed true wilderness, a place where the only lights flickering in the dark were stars, not faulty fluorescent tubes powered by a failing generator. His next destination would be quiet, remote, and absolutely free of any corporate branding promising manufactured delight. He was no longer a concept artist in training. He was an investigative documentarian of mechanical malevolence, and the next step was disappearing before Fazbear Entertainment realized they had released a variable that couldn't be easily masked or reset. The decision to flee the city was less about physical escape and more about escaping the pervasive atmosphere of the corporation. Jeremy liquidated the meager funds he had earned, the price of his terror, and purchased a used, slightly battered van, something nondescript that wouldn't draw attention. His supplies were minimal: sketchbooks, his tablet, instant coffee packets, and a small, carefully chosen collection of old-fashioned battery-powered lanterns instead of modern flashlights. He trusted light that didn't require a centralized, vulnerable power grid. His journey took him north, toward the sparsely populated mountain regions. He sought altitude, a place where the air was thin, and the electronic chatter of civilization was reduced to a distant murmur. He found a secluded, decommissioned forestry cabin listed cheaply online, the kind of place so remote it barely registered on satellite maps. The cabin itself was rustic, smelling reassuringly of pine sap and damp earth rather than ozone and stale pizza grease. In this stark isolation, the true nature of his psychological scars began to manifest. Jeremy found himself unable to tolerate quiet for too long. Absolute silence, the kind he hadn't experienced even in the deadest hours of the pizzeria night shift, felt inherently dangerous. It was the precursor to movement he couldn't see. Consequently, he kept a low, continuous white noise running through small speakers, the sound of a steady rain, something predictable and natural. His art began to shift from documentation to exorcism. He wasn't just sketching the animatronics, he was sketching the feeling of being trapped in their proximity. One recurring piece involved a stark, high-contrast rendering of the mask. He painted the fiberglass not as protective gear, but as a suffocating tomb wall, with his own eye peering out from a small, flawed crack in the cheek plate, perpetually peering into an abyss. He used heavy impasto techniques, building up layers of paint to mimic the thick, hard casing that had both saved and nearly destroyed him. He frequently thought about the older, withered units. They represented a failure of maintenance, a brutal consequence of neglect. He surmised that the management team viewed them as liabilities, whereas the toys were high-cost, high-risk assets, sophisticated tools that, when they failed with calculated intelligence. This duality fascinated and sickened him. It mirrored his own past belief that superficial polish, The network marketing seminars, the shiny new animatronics, could mask underlying rot. One afternoon, while trekking further into the woods to gather firewood, he heard a sound that snapped him instantly back to the pizzeria. A distinct rhythmic metallic clanking carried on the wind. His heart hammered against his ribs. He froze, crouching low behind a thicket of rhododendrons, scanning the empty expanse of trees. It sounded mechanical, yet too irregular for a passing logging truck. The sound faded, perhaps just the wind catching an old piece of abandoned farm equipment, but the adrenaline surge was immediate and complete. He spent the rest of the day mapping the cabin's perimeter, marking potential sightlines and hiding spots, treating the wilderness as a new, vastly larger security office. He had escaped the building, but Jeremy understood that he hadn't escaped the surveillance. He was now viewing the world through the lens of a haunted employee, forever expecting the unexpected power drain, the sudden camera outage, the cold, hard stare of something that shouldn't be alive. His career as an artist had been violently redefined. He was now dedicated to creating nightmares so potent they might serve as a warning to anyone else tempted by the promise of bright lights and cheap employment in the service of Fazbear Entertainment. The enforced solitude of the cabin began to serve a paradoxical function. It allowed Jeremy to construct barriers against the internal noise. He developed rituals centered around light and sound, measures that were almost absurdly redundant in the middle of nowhere, yet essential for maintaining a grip on his mental landscape. He positioned his lantern strategically, creating overlapping circles of warm, flickering light inside the cabin, ensuring no single corner remained steeped in pure shadow. He remembered the chilling finality of total darkness in the security office when the power would dip, that moment of absolute vulnerability before reaching for the mask. His latest sketches weren't just about the animatronics. They were explorations of negative space, the shape of absence. He was trying to draw the phantom presence of the puppet, the thing that never moved but dictated the rhythm of dread. He envisioned it not as a toy, but as a fixed point of concentrated sorrow or rage, the nucleus around which the chaotic energy of the others revolved. He used charcoal with furious intensity, smudging the edges until the figures seemed to dissolve into the paper, reflecting how easily the clear reality of the pizzeria had blurred into abstract terror. Jeremy started experiencing auditory hallucinations that were subtle but persistent. He would hear the faint, high-pitched whine of stressed electronics, even when the lanterns were the only source of sound. Sometimes, late at night, when the rain noise faded to a drizzle, he thought he could distinguish the faint sound of a muffled mechanical laugh, not menacing but eerily patronizing, the sound of an algorithm successfully executing its function. This was worse than outright aggression. It implied that even in his remote sanctuary, the system was running, and he was still being observed by something that had learned his weaknesses from that single, intense week. He found himself constantly checking the van's battery, a nervous tick replacing the power monitoring of the security panel. He worried about what would happen if the battery died during a storm, leaving him dependent solely on finite lantern fuel. This dependency brought him back to the power management dilemma, the core conflict of his employment. In the pizzeria, power was life. Here, it was merely convenience, yet the ingrained panic remained. His past career failures now looked less like personal failings and more like necessary prerequisites for his current survival. The failure as a motivational speaker had taught him about superficial confidence. The disastrous marketing venture had drilled into him the lesson that complex systems are often held together by incredibly flimsy, easily exploited core beliefs. He saw Fazbear Entertainment as the ultimate pyramid scheme, selling manufactured nostalgia while burying fatal liabilities. One morning, weeks into his self-imposed exile, Jeremy discovered a small, non-native object embedded in the soft earth near the cabin porch, a single, small, tarnished brass screw. It was unlike the rusty iron or wood screws used in the cabin's construction. It was meticulously machined, industrial, and frankly, too clean for this environment. He picked it up, his fingers recoiling slightly from the cold metal. It was the kind of high-grade fastener that would be used in precision engineering, the kind of fastener that might hold a joint in a high-end animatronic endoskeleton. He didn't know if it had blown in on the wind from a distant scrapyard or if it had been deliberately placed, but he added it to his collection of evidence, a small, tangible token of his ongoing, unsanctioned investigation. He knew then that his retreat wasn't the end of the story. It was just a strategic repositioning, allowing him to analyze the enemy from a distance without the immediate pressure of a 5-night deadline. The discovery of the brass screw was a tipping point, transforming Jeremy's passive fear into active paranoia. The screw was too perfect, too out of place among the rough detritus of the mountain forest. He kept it in a small padded tin, treating it like a volatile chemical sample. It confirmed his deepest suspicion. The periphery of the danger was wider than he had assumed. Fazbear Entertainment's influence, or at least the residual effects of their engineering, seemed to seep into the environment itself. He stopped sleeping in the main room of the cabin, opting instead for the cramped windowless storage shed attached to the rear, arguing internally that the shed offered superior structural integrity against sudden unseen intrusions. The shed lacked insulation, making the nights bitterly cold, but the cold was predictable. He bundled up in thick wool blankets, attempting to channel the stoicism he associated with the grizzled survivalists he'd read about during his initial foray into researching remote living. His artistic output became increasingly abstract and focused on internal mechanics. He sketched wiring diagrams based on the brief glimpses he caught of Mangle's exposed internals, overlaying them with frantic looping lines representing the creature's unpredictable descent. He began using phosphorescent paint mixed into his charcoal, allowing his drawings to glow faintly in the dark, mimicking the eerie, self-illuminating quality of the animatronic's optical sensors. The auditory hallucinations intensified, gaining complexity. The vague whining morphed into distinct, though fragmented musical cues, snatches of the cheerful, grating children's songs that played over the pizzeria's loudspeakers during the day. These auditory ghosts were perhaps the cruelest aspect of his haunting. They reminded him of the deliberate, saccharine contrast between the establishment's intended purpose and its violent reality. He would stop mid-sketch, convinced he heard the distant, tinny sound of a music box winding down, the sound inextricably linked to the puppet's silent sentinel position. Jeremy started running drills, purely self-imposed. He would simulate power failure by plunging the shed into darkness, counting down the seconds before lighting a single lantern, timing his movements with obsessive accuracy. He wasn't trying to be faster than the animatronics anymore. He was trying to measure the exact speed of his own panic response, hoping to iron out the irrational hesitation that had nearly cost him his life during the Toy Bonnie encounter. He realized the key to his initial survival wasn't bravery, but simply the fact that his contract had an endpoint. The machines were programmed to maintain the illusion of operation until the clock struck 6 a.m. Without that artificial constraint, they would, theoretically, continue to hunt indefinitely. This led him to a chilling conclusion about the older guard, Phone Guy. Perhaps his silence wasn't voluntary retirement, but the moment the programmed constraint ceased, and the hunt continued without reprieve. One evening, while testing a new lantern setup, Jeremy noticed something odd about the reflection in the glass of the storage shed window. For a fleeting second, the reflection showed not just his own gaunt, bearded face, but superimposed over it, the faint, grinning silhouette of Toy Chica's beak. It was gone instantly, a perfect optical trick caused by the refraction of the multiple lantern lights, yet the image was burned into his mind. It implied that the surveillance wasn't external hardware. It was something embedded in him. A persistent bias towards seeing the threat everywhere. He was becoming the haunted security room, carrying the terror internally, a permanent update installed by a vengeful programming sequence. He knew then that leaving the pizzeria was merely the first step. The true escape would require dismantling the perception the machines had forced upon him. The persistent presence of the environment mimicking his trauma spurred Jeremy toward a final desperate act of creative integration. He understood that if he could not eliminate the perception, he had to exhaust it through sheer output. He converted the entire small cabin into a gallery of his ordeal, utilizing every flat surface for his feverish sketches and paintings. He used natural pigments he painstakingly ground from local clays and minerals, creating earthy tones that he hoped would ground his work in reality, contrasting sharply with the artificial nightmare colors of his memories. He dedicated an entire wall to the withered units, painting them in stark chiaroscuro, emphasizing the violence of their deterioration. He depicted withered Foxy not as a pirate, but as a shattered kinetic sculpture, caught mid-lunge, the missing eye socket rendered as a black, absolute void that seemed to absorb the surrounding light. This obsessive detailing allowed him to process the raw aggression without being overwhelmed by it. He was the curator of his own haunting. The puppet remained the most elusive subject. Jeremy tried to capture the feeling of being weighed down by its silent observation. He used thin layers of heavily diluted black ink, building up a translucent figure that seemed to shift depending on the angle of the lantern light. He imagined the date he'd seen scribbled on the box wasn't a past tragedy, but an expiration date for the current cycle, a deadline for the next necessary replacement, a new guard, a new victim. His physical health deteriorated further, marked by sudden periods of intense, restless energy, followed by near catatonic exhaustion. He stopped eating regularly, subsisting on coffee and the high of creative intensity. This mirrored the extreme power fluctuations of the job. Moments of frantic activity, followed by total depletion. He was living his 5-night contract on a permanent, decentralized loop. One frigid afternoon, while securing the shed door with additional makeshift wooden braces, a poor substitute for reinforced steel, but better than nothing, he noticed the brass screw he had collected. It was resting on a nearby stump where he'd left his tools. As he approached it, the sunlight caught its surface, and for a horrifying second, the reflection wasn't just distorted light. It seemed to project a miniature fleeting image of the security room monitor, displaying a flickering static. He snatched it up, his hand closing around the cold metal so tightly, his knuckles turned white. This object wasn't inert. It was a conduit, perhaps a component that retained a residual connection to the central network he had fled. He knew he couldn't destroy it, not yet. If it was a tracking device or a communication component, destroying it might be interpreted by the system as an act of final defiance, potentially triggering a more direct, localized response, like a system reboot or an automated containment protocol. Instead, he wrapped the screw in heavy layers of insulation tape, then sealed it inside a block of hardened resin he had intended to use for a landscape base. He buried the resin block deep beneath the largest pine tree near the cabin, marking the spot with 3 inconspicuous stones arranged in a triangle, a deliberate, self-imposed boundary marker. Having created this physical separation from the most tangible piece of evidence, Jeremy felt a strange lightness. The world outside his cabin, while still fraught with perceived threats, no longer held the same suffocating immediacy. He looked up at the mountain peaks, vast and indifferent to the petty cruelties of corporate amusement parks. He picked up a clean sheet of paper, and for the first time in months, he began to sketch something entirely new, an open road, stretching toward a hazy, unidentifiable horizon. It wasn't an escape route. It was a canvas for a future that hadn't been written by someone else's faulty programming. He was finally starting to draw life, rather than documenting death. The act of burying the resin-encased screw was a symbolic interment of his time as a night guard, a deliberate severing of the physical tether to the horror. But the landscape of his mind remained scarred, and the silence of the mountains, though initially sought for solace, now demanded a new kind of vigilance. Jeremy realized that escaping the building hadn't meant escaping the psychological contract. The ownership claim Fazbear Entertainment placed on its employees, or rather, its former employees, was not temporal, but permanent, etched into the nervous system. He began a period of intense physical conditioning, driven by the need to prove that his body was resilient, capable of reacting faster than his panic. He didn't lift weights. He practiced endurance, long, grueling hikes up the steeper slopes of the mountains, forcing his lungs to work under duress. He was training for a marathon he hadn't signed up for, a race against the degradation of his own mental firewall. He channeled the desperate energy that once went into checking security cameras into rigorous rhythmic motion, replacing the anxiety feedback loop with the steady burn of exertion. His artistic focus narrowed further, moving beyond simple depiction to the exploration of camouflage and blending. He studied natural patterns, the mottled bark of birch trees, the way moss covered stone, seeking principles of perfect visual integration. If the animatronics hunted through sophisticated pattern recognition, his defense, he theorized, lay in becoming the most boring, unremarkable pattern possible. He started painting exclusively in muted greens and browns, his canvases becoming studies in near invisibility. He was designing a new form of camouflage, one tailored to evade predatory machine vision. The memory of the toy animatronics' uncanny smoothness was a constant torment. Their perfection, the way their joints moved without the necessary grit and grind of real machinery, suggested an unnatural engineering, something too careful. Jeremy started sketching schematics of his own, overly complicated, deliberately inefficient mechanisms built from salvaged junk he collected on his hikes, rusty gears, bent tin, loose springs. He built small kinetic sculptures that moved with grinding audible imperfection, a deliberate countersignal to the clean, silent menace of the toys. These sculptures were his conversation with the silence, tiny monuments to mechanical failure and honest decay. One afternoon, while tracing the creek bed below his cabin, he found a small, discarded electronic component, a small, durable battery pack, clearly not native to the cabin's ancient wiring. It was sleek, modern, and its casing bore a faint, almost invisible logo he recognized from the side of a discarded maintenance cart he'd seen briefly in the loading bay during his first night. It wasn't a Fazbear logo, but a subcontractor's mark, one listed frequently in the corporate records he'd researched at the library. This suggested that the system wasn't just relying on the old animatronics. The network was actively maintaining and monitoring the perimeter, perhaps even tracking the residual energy signatures of those who had escaped. The mountains were not a sanctuary. They were simply a larger, less populated zone of operation. Jeremy didn't bury this component. Instead, he took it back to the cabin and dismantled it carefully, separating the internal cells. He wasn't interested in using the power. He was interested in rendering the components inert. He submerged the battery in a bucket of creek water mixed with rock salt, watching as the metal casing slowly began to corrode, a miniature controlled act of systemic breakdown. He was learning to neutralize the system, one small piece at a time, realizing that surviving Freddy Fazbear's was less about outrunning the monsters and more about systematically deconstructing the technological paranoia they had installed within him. His art was no longer documentation. It was active, chemical counterintelligence. The cinematic adaptation of Five Nights at Freddy's 2, slated for a 2025 release, arrives burdened with the immense expectations set by its predecessor, a film that successfully navigated the difficult transition from beloved video game lore to mainstream horror appeal. This sequel, however, faces a significantly steeper climb, primarily due to the inherent structural challenges of adapting the source material's escalating claustrophobia and narrative complexity. The central tension of the first film revolved around Mike Schmidt's desperate attempt to reclaim custody of his sister, grounding the supernatural terror in palpable familial stakes. FNAF 2 discards this direct emotional anchor, thrusting the narrative back into the realm of pure workplace horror, though on a potentially grander, more chaotic scale. The return to the security guard role, even if featuring a new, perhaps less emotionally scarred protagonist, risks rehashing the foundational mechanics of the first installment. The genius of the original game, and its successful cinematic interpretation, lay in its sustained sense of vulnerability. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, even the original, felt relatively contained. The sequel promises the introduction of the toy animatronics, sleeker, more overtly sinister versions of the established horrors, alongside the withered relics of the past. This influx of new mechanical antagonists threatens to dilute the singular focus that made the original encounters so terrifying. Instead of a slowly mounting dread against a familiar few, we might be facing a sensory overload, a problem common in sequels that mistake quantity of scares for quality of horror. Examining the potential directorial vision, if we assume a return of the creative team, the challenge lies in integrating the deeper lore, the mystery surrounding the missing children, and William Afton's omnipresence without resorting to heavy-handed exposition dumps. The first film smartly utilized Afton primarily as a looming, unseen threat, culminating in a satisfying, if slightly rushed, physical confrontation. Freddy F2, set later and likely featuring a new location or a significantly renovated Freddy's, must weave the established mythology into the daily routine of the night shift. If the film leans too heavily on flashbacks or visions, it risks fracturing the immediacy of the present danger. The success hinges on making the lore feel like an organic stain on the environment, rather than a historical footnote the audience must memorize. The atmosphere needs a significant upgrade. The original pizzeria possessed a greasy, forgotten Americana quality. The sequel's setting, likely the brightly lit, deceptively cheerful environment of the second location, offers a contrasting aesthetic ripe for subversion. The toy animatronics, with their unnervingly wide eyes and painted smiles, should be utilized to exploit this uncanny valley effect. Imagine a sequence where the protagonist, perhaps a young, ambitious security guard, inspired by the cautionary tales of his predecessor's disappearance, initially finds the new models less threatening than the rotting corpses of the Wizards. The shift from misplaced affection for the characters to sheer mechanical terror must be meticulously paced. The character development, a crucial element absent in the source games, will be strained. If the new protagonist lacks the potent motivation of Mike's sibling concern, their resilience must stem from a compelling professional drive or a hidden personal connection to Fazbear Entertainment's dark past. A director must resist the urge to simply create another blank slate for the audience to project onto. Perhaps the character is a struggling film student, eager to document the rumored hauntings, drawing inspiration from the burgeoning found footage aesthetic, or a former employee seeking vindication after being wrongly dismissed. This internal life must fuel their desperate attempts to manage the escalating security protocols, the visual representation of their struggle, against the relentless advance of the newly activated and perhaps network-controlled animatronics. The integration of established characters remains a wild card. If any original cast members return, their presence must serve the plot, not merely function as fan service. A cameo by a beleaguered police officer or a desperate former employee trying to warn the new guard could effectively bridge the narrative gap, illustrating the cyclical nature of the horror tied to the Fazbear brand. Ultimately, FNAF 2 must evolve beyond simply surviving the night. It needs to deepen the audience's understanding of why these events persist, transforming a series of jump scares into a cohesive, escalating tragedy of corporate negligence and spiritual entrapment. The stakes are higher now. Surviving one night might only reveal the larger, more sinister machinery at play. The anticipation surrounding this sequel is further complicated by the known trajectory of the game franchise itself, which quickly escalated from isolated haunting to sprawling conspiracy. If the film mirrors this, the 2025 installment must convincingly handle the introduction of the puppet and the broader implication of possessing human souls within the metallic shells. This requires a delicate balancing act. The audience who enjoyed the grounded suspense of the first film will crave that visceral close-quarters fear, while the dedicated fan base demands the incorporation of deeper, more esoteric lore elements. A misstep here could result in a bloated narrative suffering from sequelitis, where every unanswered question from the first film is answered too quickly, or conversely, where the new threats feel utterly disconnected from the emotional core that made the previous film resonate. Consider the emotional landscape of the prospective protagonist, perhaps a young woman named Chloe, fresh out of college, drawn to the relative stability and seemingly low-risk environment of the new, updated Freddy's. Her initial interactions with the toy animatronics, Toy Freddy, Tangle, Mangle, Balloon Boy, would be colored by an almost patronizing sense of superiority over the supposedly primitive, withered models. Chloe, unlike the haunted Mike, might possess a degree of technical acumen, seeing the security cameras and maintenance logs not just as tools for survival, but as a solvable technical puzzle. This optimism is the perfect foil for the true horror. The camera feed glitching out isn't just a technical malfunction. It's the entity mocking her reliance on modern solutions. Her moments of panic would stem not just from the fear of being killed, but from the agonizing realization that her intelligence cannot outmaneuver the sheer, calculated malevolence residing within these smiling constructs. The withered animatronics, relegated to the background, or perhaps only seen in dimly lit storage areas, serve as crucial emotional signposts. They represent the past, the victims whose suffering fuels the current activity. When Chloe stumbles upon an archival photograph or a discarded employee file mentioning the closure of the previous location, the visceral shock of seeing the rotting jaws of withered Bonnie shouldn't just trigger a jump scare. It should evoke a chilling sense of historical dread. She is not just fighting new robots, she is tangling with the inescapable consequences of past atrocities. The potential inspiration drawn from the work of directors who excel at atmosphere over gore, such as early David Fincher, or even the sustained tension found in John Carpenter's best work, will be vital. If the sequel leans too heavily into the kinetic energy of modern horror, it risks losing the uncomfortable silence between the scares. The music, too, must evolve. The simple, almost lullaby-like quality of the first film's score should give way to something more discordant, perhaps incorporating distorted electronic sounds that mimic the broken mechanics of the toy line, mirroring the way their cheerful exterior cracks under pressure. Furthermore, the depiction of William Afton's influence needs careful calibration. If Afton appears physically, it risks undermining the psychological terror that defined the first film's final act. A more effective approach might be to have Afton appear solely through pre-recorded training tapes or cryptic maintenance logs that Chloe uncovers, his voice a saccharine baritone masking profound psychopathy. These moments would not only provide exposition, but also serve as chilling character studies in how an individual can weaponize corporate branding and public trust. Chloe's descent into understanding Afton would mirror the audience's own deepening comprehension of the franchise's dark heart, binding her personal struggle intrinsically to the overarching mythology. The emotional weight of the sequel will rest on whether the audience believes Chloe can truly sever the cycle, or if she is merely the next sacrificial lamb in the enduring, profitable nightmare that is Fazbear Entertainment. The true test for the 2025 iteration lies not just in presenting new threats, but in effectively communicating the psychological toll this cyclical horror exacts. If the protagonist is indeed Chloe, a character initially brimming with modern confidence, her degradation must be portrayed with the slow, agonizing precision of a psychological thriller, rather than a straightforward action horror piece. We need to see the moments where her technological reliance fails her, where the meticulously organized digital world of the security system becomes a cage built by the animatronic's superior, almost intuitive understanding of their domain. Imagine a scene where Chloe, exhausted and jittery after several nights, attempts to reroute power, only for the system interface to flash a distorted image of Balloon Boy, his signature giggle warped into a sound that suggests pure digital contempt for her efforts. This isn't just a jump scare, it's an assault on her perceived competence. The dynamic between the withered and toy animatronics needs thematic depth. The withereds are relics, embodiments of the past's unprocessed trauma, often sluggish but possessing raw, unpredictable rage fueled by residual agony. The toys, conversely, represent a cold corporate attempt to sanitize and repackage the horror. They are designed to observe, learn, and interact socially, which makes their eventual mechanical hostility far more insidious. This duality could manifest in Chloe's perception. The withereds invoke visceral fear rooted in the grotesque, while the toys trigger existential dread related to surveillance and manipulation. A truly unnerving moment might involve Mangle, the seemingly dismantled curiosity, perfectly articulating a phrase overheard earlier from Chloe's personal phone conversations, demonstrating the extent of their intrusion beyond the pizza parlor walls. The film must also navigate the temptation to rush the Afton reveal. If the first film provided a relatively satisfying, if rushed, payoff, the sequel risks over-explaining his motivations. A superior narrative path would be to present Afton not as a clear villain to be fought in the climax, but as the architect of a flawed yet dangerously resilient system. Perhaps Chloe discovers that the facial recognition software installed in the toy line is not designed to identify intruders, but to specifically track and neutralize individuals, showing signs of empathy or investigators asking too many questions about the old lawsuits. This elevates Afton from a mad scientist to a master manipulator of corporate infrastructure, a villain whose greatest weapon is plausible deniability hidden beneath layers of cheerful branding. The supporting cast, if any, must be sharply drawn to enhance Chloe's isolation. If there is a daytime manager, they shouldn't be merely dismissive. They should be actively complicit through willful ignorance, mirroring the societal tendency to ignore uncomfortable truths presented in attractive packaging. This manager could be portrayed with the forced cheerfulness of a mid-level executive desperately trying to meet quarterly targets, viewing the unexplained disappearances as unfortunate but manageable public relations incidents. Chloe's desperation would then be compounded by the knowledge that the only person she can report the escalating terror to is the one most invested in maintaining the illusion of safety. The emotional resonance of this sequel will depend on whether Chloe can break through this facade of manufactured happiness, finding a genuine human connection amidst the clanking programmed malice, or if she becomes just another cautionary tale whispered between shifts at a new, unsuspecting Fazbear location. The incorporation of the lore surrounding the puppet and the concept of soul transference demands a visual language that avoids overt supernatural theatrics, leaning instead into unsettling ambiguity. If the film seeks to emulate the unsettling realism established in the first installment, the manifestation of these captured souls should feel like a byproduct of corrupted technology rather than explicit spectral visitation. Consider the possibility of residual energy manifesting only in the periphery of the security cameras, a flicker of color near the prize corner, or a sudden, inexplicable dip in ambient temperature registered by the night shift's internal monitoring systems, rather than a full-bodied apparition. This restraint honors the game's initial premise, that the horror is mechanical, given terrible purpose by human tragedy. If the puppet is to feature prominently, its design and movement must evoke profound sorrow mixed with protective fury. Unlike the aggressive pursuit of the other animatronics, the puppet's presence should feel like an acknowledgement, a slow, deliberate gaze that pierces through the digital static. Perhaps Chloe, in her investigation of the ventilation in shafts or unused storage rooms, spaces reminiscent of the cramped desperation of the original FNAF 1 layout, stumbles upon evidence suggesting the puppet is less an attacker and more a reluctant guardian, actively interfering with Afton's more advanced programming through subtle electrical sabotage. This reframing positions the puppet not as another threat, but as a complex, potentially tragic figure whose actions guide the protagonist toward understanding the deeper mechanism of the haunting, perhaps leaving behind carefully placed clues disguised as maintenance errors. The transition from the worn, tangible grime of the first location to the supposedly modern veneer of the second establishment requires a specific emotional texture. The initial impression of the new pizzeria should be one of aggressive sterility, too clean, too brightly lit, with music that is just slightly too upbeat, creating an unnerving sense of temporal displacement. Chloe's initial interactions with the smiling face of Toy Chica or the relentless patter of Balloon Boy should feel like being trapped inside a poorly executed commercial. This artificiality is the film's canvas for decay. Every scratch on Toy Bonnie's pristine shell, every moment the ventilation hums too loudly, should signal the underlying rot, the souls straining against their shiny new prisons. The ultimate success of the sequel will hinge on its ability to handle the escalating body count, if there is one, with gravity. If Chloe loses colleagues or witnesses events that escalate beyond simple security breaches, these losses must serve to fuel her resolve, not just ratchet up the action quotient. The narrative must make clear that each destroyed or deactivated animatronic means an additional soul is either released into chaos or further bound to the machinery, providing a continuous ethical dilemma for the protagonist. Is survival justification for further destruction? This moral calculus, embedded within the frantic need to survive until dawn, elevates the narrative beyond a simple monster mashup into a true examination of legacy, corporate responsibility, and the unbearable weight of misplaced innocence. The emotional weight carried by the new security guard, Chloe, must be constantly reinforced by the film's sound design, transforming ambient noise into psychological torture. Given the introduction of the toy animatronics, who possess integrated audio and facial recognition software, the horror shifts from purely visual and auditory shock to an invasion of privacy and identity. Imagine the quiet moments Chloe believes she has successfully hidden in a maintenance closet, only for the speakers to broadcast a perfectly synthesized, gentle inquiry. "Chloe, are you feeling all right? Your heart rate seems elevated." Mimicking a sympathetic colleague, or perhaps even a recording of her own worried mother. This level of personalized intrusion capitalizes on the modern fear of being constantly monitored and understood by unseen systems. The animatronics are no longer just stumbling toward her. They are anticipating her next move based on her recorded habits. The visual representation of the withered animatronics needs to lean into the pathetic rather than the purely menacing. If Chloe is forced to use the older withered models for parts or temporary distraction, a bleak necessity of the second location's under-resourced security, the act should feel morally compromising. Pulling a single rusted arm from withered Foxy shouldn't result in a satisfying clang, but a low, drawn-out mechanical groan that sounds less like protesting metal and more like a dying breath. This forces Chloe to confront the inherent tragedy of her situation. Survival requires desecrating the very victims she seeks to understand. Her hands would tremble, not just from fear of attack, but from the guilt of participation in this ongoing violation. Furthermore, the film should explore the character of Mike Schmidt, the protagonist of the first movie, not as a direct participant, but as a ghost or an urban legend within the Fazbear ecosystem. Perhaps Chloe finds cryptic, hastily scribbled notes left behind in electrical boxes or under loose floorboards. Warnings about specific camera blind spots or anomalies that only Mike would know. These notes would be fragmented, barely legible, imbued with the raw terror of his final night, serving as an analog for the established yet unreliable canon of the games. This allows the sequel to acknowledge its predecessor and deepen the sense of inherited trauma without forcing the original actor into an unearned role. Mike becomes the patron saint of the doomed night shift, his unseen struggles providing a vital, almost mythological context for Chloe's current predicament. The film's pacing must carefully delineate between the two distinct types of horror. The toy animatronics should operate with a sense of corporate efficiency, their movements precise, their presence planned, utilizing vents and predetermined patrols to box Chloe in, representing the horror of systemic control. Conversely, the Withereds should erupt unpredictably, powered by raw, tormented spirit, embodying the horror of pure, untamed agony. When the two forces inevitably clash, perhaps Mangle malfunctions near a deactivated withered Bonnie, causing a brief, chaotic disruption, Chloe must make a split-second decision. Utilize the confusion to escape, or exploit the resulting system failure to learn more about the souls involved. This decision-making under extreme duress is where the character's defining moments will emerge, cementing her fate as either a survivor who carries the scars, or another cautionary tale absorbed into the grim history of Fazbear Entertainment. The depiction of the environment itself must act as a character deeply invested in the ongoing tragedy, particularly in the sequel's new location, which presumably boasts newer, shinier amenities intended to mask the rot. If the first film excelled at showcasing the claustrophobia of decay, FNAF 2 needs to master the unsettling nature of synthetic imprisonment. The expansive, brightly lit play areas and dining halls of the new pizzeria, while offering Chloe more physical space to maneuver, should feel infinitely more exposed. The wide-angle surveillance cameras, designed for comprehensive coverage, become instruments of universal scrutiny, eliminating any true safe haven. When the lights flicker, or the ventilation system cycles down, the sudden shift to near darkness in such a vast space creates a more profound sense of vulnerability than the tight confines of the original office. It's the horror of the spotlight turning off, leaving the victim exposed on a giant empty stage. The emotional strain on Chloe will manifest in her relationship with the prize corner, which, in the game lore, is intrinsically linked to the puppet and the origins of the hauntings. This area needs to be visually striking, a mountain of garishly colored, inexpensive toys that symbolize the superficiality of Fazbear Entertainment's attempts at creating joy. Chloe might find herself drawn to one seemingly inert, minor prize, perhaps a plush counterpart to a main animatronic, that subtly mirrors her own emotional state. If she is anxious, the plush's button eyes might seem too wide. If she is exhausted, it might appear slumped in imitation of her posture. This inanimate object becomes a sounding board for her escalating paranoia, the one item in the room that doesn't actively try to kill her, yet silently judges her every failure. This relationship provides a critical emotional anchor point against the chaos unleashed by the active threats. The interaction between the toy animatronics and the established lore surrounding Afton's victims must be handled with chilling nuance. If the toy models are indeed capable of overriding the older programming, their actions suggest a direct, almost conscious targeting of the souls still trapped within the withered shells. A key sequence could involve Chloe witnessing a toy animatronic methodically dismantling a withered unit, not out of malfunction, but with calculated intent, an attempt by the newer, cleaner energy to purge the evidence of the past, or perhaps to absorb the residual spiritual energy. This sets up a terrifying internal conflict. The enemy isn't unified. It's a battle for dominance between corrupted technological iterations housing the same tormented spirits. Chloe is caught in the crossfire of an ethereal civil war fought with metal and wires. The film's dedication to character depth will be proven by how it portrays the protagonist's psychological breaking point. For a technically savvy character like Chloe, the breakdown won't be purely animalistic fear. It will be intellectual defeat. The true climax might not be a physical confrontation, but the moment Chloe realizes that the override codes she painstakingly developed, the very tools of her presumed superiority, were programmed by Afton years ago, designed to fail spectacularly and lead the investigator into a trap designed to look like a system crash. Her realization would be a moment of crushing, internalized betrayal. The infrastructure she relied upon was engineered for her destruction from the outset. This elevates the film's themes from surviving a haunting to escaping a perfectly engineered system of control, leaving the audience with the unsettling understanding that the fight against Fazbear Entertainment requires dismantling its very corporate structure, not just surviving one more night shift. The narrative's success ultimately hinges on how effectively the film visualizes the concept of residual memory imprinted on the physical space. The first film dealt an immediate threat. The sequel must navigate the weight of history embedded in the very architecture. If the new pizzeria boasts extensive digital signage and interactive displays, a hallmark of the toy era, these screens should become conduits for fragmented memories that bleed through the intended content. Imagine Chloe attempting to monitor the main stage, only for a brightly rendered advertisement for pizza to momentarily dissolve, revealing a fleeting silent tableau of the missing children huddled in terror, or a quick flash of the original blood-splattered wall of the previous location superimposed over the vibrant wallpaper. These visual glitches should be rare, almost subliminal, requiring the audience and Chloe to question their own sanity and perception. The introduction of Balloon Boy, often a source of minor irritation in the games, presents a unique opportunity for psychological horror, rooted in ceaseless mocking presence rather than brute force. His primary mechanic often involves disabling the player's lights or voice commands. In the film, Balloon Boy shouldn't just say, "Hi." He should parrot phrases Chloe whispered privately into a headset or on a personal call, twisted into taunts about her isolation. His diminutive size and relentless high-pitched vocalizations, especially when magnified by the building's PA system, would erode her focus far more effectively than the lumbering threats. He embodies the realization that even in supposed solitude, one is never truly unobserved or unheard, an acute anxiety in the digital age. Furthermore, the withered character should serve as powerful reminders of the human cost of Afton's creation, requiring moments of near recognition. Perhaps when Chloe gets a rare, clear look at the damaged face of withered Chica, There is a brief, impossible moment where the empty eye sockets seem to focus with a clarity that mirrors profound grief, suggesting the soul inside is struggling against the chassis. This is vital for differentiating the Wizards from the newer models. They are trapped suffering, whereas the toys are corrupted tools. A scene where Chloe finds withered Bonnie deactivated in the dark, and upon shining her light, sees a small hand-drawn picture tucked haphazardly inside the chest cavity. A child's drawing of a family would provide a momentary, devastating glimpse into the original victim's humanity, fueling Chloe's moral imperative to perhaps find a way to stop the cycle without outright destruction. The film must avoid simplifying the motivations of the leadership behind Fazbear Entertainment. If the sequel is to feel grounded, the corporate entity must be portrayed as monstrously indifferent rather than overtly cartoonishly evil. The managers of the second location are likely aware of the rumors, but their primary allegiance is to profit margins and maintaining the cheerful facade. Any physical evidence Chloe uncovers, faulty wiring, emergency overrides, suspiciously large insurance payouts, should be met not with confrontation, but with bureaucratic stonewalling. This institutional negligence forms the invisible, yet most powerful antagonist. Chloe isn't just fighting killer robots. She is fighting the entire self-preserving machinery of a company determined to sweep unspeakable acts under a very bright, very cheerful rug. The ultimate victory, therefore, might not be escaping the building, but successfully leaking the evidence that forces the corporation to acknowledge its sins, even if it costs her everything. The sequel's success in establishing emotional stakes must also involve a clever handling of the inevitable crossover should any element from the first film's resolved plot resurface. If Mike Schmidt's fate remains ambiguous, or if the fate of his sister Abby is tied into the new narrative, it must be integrated organically, not as a cheap narrative lifeline. Perhaps Chloe discovers a collection of recovered files related to the previous location's investigation, documents mentioning the unusual circumstances of Mike's survival or disappearance. These files could suggest that Mike, having confronted the initial core of the evil, inadvertently set a precedent or triggered a countermeasure within Afton's network, inadvertently making Chloe's job infinitely harder. This concept of inherited difficulty lends a tragic weight to the continuity, suggesting that escaping one night only means inheriting the previous survivor's unfinished battle. The atmosphere needs to convey the feeling of being relentlessly observed by entities designed for observation. The toy animatronics, especially the pristine toy Chica and the articulated Mangle, should possess an unnerving smoothness to their movements, betraying none of the mechanical jerks associated with the Wizards. This seamless operation suggests higher levels of programming and integration with the building systems. When Chloe uses the motion tracker, the toy signatures should appear not as simple dots moving across a screen, but as intelligent vectors charting probable routes based on past behavioral analysis. The fear is not just that they are coming, but that they are predicting her based on data harvested over years, data that might even include Mike's own failed strategies. The character arc for Chloe must include a moment where she attempts to appeal to the perceived innocence of the setting, an emotional miscalculation that proves disastrous. For instance, finding a small, functioning karaoke machine in the main dining area. She might attempt to use a voice command or play cheerful music, hoping to distract or soothe the animatronics, viewing them momentarily as broken pieces of entertainment rather than sentient threats. The response should be immediate and terrifying. The music suddenly warps into a screeching feedback loop, and the nearest toy animatronic uses the sound burst as cover to close a significant distance, demonstrating that any attempt to interact with the environment using its intended, cheerful purpose will be immediately corrupted and weaponized against her. Furthermore, the visual staging of the withered characters needs to emphasize their haunting quality over simple threat. If Chloe needs to traverse an area where they are stored, perhaps an old decommissioned section of the pizzeria where the withered gang is haphazardly piled, the scene should feel like walking through a morgue of failed experiments. The lighting here should be deliberately poor, relying solely on Chloe's weak flashlight, forcing the audience to strain their eyes, much like a player straining to see a threat on a low-resolution monitor. When withered Freddy's massive frame is illuminated, the shot should linger on the degradation, the exposed endoskeleton suggesting immense pain, perhaps even a visible, almost organic-looking residue clinging to the joints, reminding the audience that these are not just robots, but physical prisons housing eternal anguish, a concept that should weigh heavily on Chloe's conscience as she considers disabling them permanently. The conceptual framework of the sequel must thoroughly explore the theme of manufactured nostalgia versus genuine trauma, using the visual contrast between the two animatronic generations to drive this emotional wedge. The toy animatronics are essentially corporate propaganda. Sleek, smiling faces designed to evoke comfort and trust in a post-scandal world. Chloe's growing cynicism should directly mirror her inability to reconcile this cheerful facade with the tangible evidence of suffering she uncovers. When she reviews security footage, the toy models should move with an almost unsettling fluidity during their normal operational hours, their programmed interactions with the few daytime staff appearing perfectly amicable. This false normalcy is the film's most potent source of dread. The horror is not just in the night, but in the meticulous, high-tech infrastructure designed to hide the truth in plain sight during the day. The narrative tension arising from the addition of multiple simultaneous threats, the relentless surveillance of the toys versus the unpredictable spiritual eruptions of the withereds, requires a highly orchestrated sequence design. Imagine a scenario where Chloe is forced to distract the main toy group, perhaps by triggering an automated cleaning cycle in a distant wing, only for the resulting noise to awaken the withered cohort hidden nearby. This forces her into a bifurcated strategy, managing the sophisticated, data-driven attacks from the toys, while simultaneously evading the raw, agonizing lurches of the withereds. Success in evading one group should inherently increase the danger posed by the other, creating a constant, unbearable pressure that fragments Chloe's decision-making capabilities. The internal monologue or diary entries of Chloe, if used sparingly, must articulate the unique burden of fighting a technologically superior, spiritually fueled enemy. Her entries shouldn't just detail the scares, but analyze the failures of the security systems, how the facial recognition glitches when withered Bonnie gets too close, or how the network prioritizes tracking her location over reporting the physical damage inflicted by Mangle. This intellectualization of her terror shows a character fighting to retain her sanity by imposing logic onto an illogical situation. Her moments of near breakdown will come when the logic fails, when the predictable patterns of the machines suddenly dissolve into pure chaotic malevolence, suggesting the souls inside have momentarily gained full control, overriding Afton's residual programming. The role of the puppet, if centered around protection rather than aggression, demands a subtle, almost painterly approach to its appearances. Instead of confronting Chloe, the puppet might manifest briefly in key locations where evidence is hidden or where Chloe is about to make a fatal error. For instance, if Chloe reaches for a specific maintenance panel that contains a critical piece of Afton's historical data, a shadow might fall over her hand, and she sees the puppet's masked face inches from hers in the reflection of the glass. Not threatening her, but warning her away from touching something too dangerous, or perhaps guiding her toward the correct circuit breaker to temporarily disrupt the toy network's surveillance grid. This positions the puppet as a tragic intermediary, an ancient spiritual defense mechanism trying to communicate necessary truths to the current, living investigator trapped within the machinery of the ongoing disaster. The emotional payoff here is the faint possibility of alliance with the dead against the very systems designed to profit from their suffering. The film adaptation of Five Nights at Freddy's 2 must successfully differentiate the sheer scope of the threat from the oppressive claustrophobia of the first installment, translating the game's jump from a single location to multiple interconnected disaster zones. If the sequel employs a sprawling, perhaps multi-story version of the new Freddy's location, the challenge for Chloe will be managing situational awareness across a vast, often inaccessible electronic blueprint. The anxiety shifts from what is behind that door to where is the attack originating from across the entire facility. This larger environment demands a reliance on the security systems, thus making their inevitable corruption by the animatronics a far more catastrophic event than simply losing power in a single office. The building itself becomes an antagonist, its complex network of cameras, automated doors, and ventilation shafts serving as the toy animatronics circulatory system. The emotional toll on Chloe will be exacerbated by the concept of the party room, the area where the most active toy units, Toy Freddy, Toy Bonnie, and Toy Chica, tend to congregate. This area should be bathed in an aggressively cheerful, almost neon-drenched light, making any dark figure moving through it appear as a grotesque distortion of the intended merriment. If Chloe must venture into this brightly lit danger zone, perhaps to manually reset a crucial server core, the scene should be filmed with a deliberate, uncomfortable stillness, where the silence is heavier than any scream. The toy animatronics should watch her progress, not with sudden aggressive lunges, but with slow, synchronized head tilts, their painted eyes reflecting the harsh lighting in a way that suggests deep, calculating contempt for her presence. The role of Afton's legacy must permeate the very fabric of the sequel's production design, suggesting a generational failure of oversight. Chloe might discover that the initial dilapidated Freddy's from the first film was not simply closed, but deliberately sold at a massive loss to a shell corporation, likely one still quietly controlled by Afton's estate, specifically to build this new, high-tech facility where the security protocols are subtly designed to fail in ways that implicate any current employee. The physical evidence of this cover-up could be found in archived blueprints showing the withered location existing directly beneath the new one, connected by sealed-off maintenance tunnels, a subterranean layer of true horror beneath the superficial modernity. Should the puppet play a guiding role, its communication must remain entirely nonverbal and ethereal, perhaps manifesting only as visual interference on screens displaying data related to the missing children. For instance, when Chloe accesses a file detailing the initial police reports, the data stream might be obscured by flowing, dark, ink-like material that resolves itself into the shape of the puppet's iconic face before dissipating. This nonverbal guidance suggests a spirit focused solely on revealing Afton's machinations, viewing the security guard as a necessary, if temporary, proxy in a long-running spiritual war. The emotional connection here is one of shared, desperate opposition to the corporate machine, even if the means of communication remain terrifyingly spectral. Ultimately, FNAF 2 must escalate the stakes from mere survival to a fight for historical truth. Chloe's journey is not about clocking out at 6 a.m. It is about achieving a lasting consequence against the entity that institutionalized childhood tragedy for profit. Her resilience will be measured not by how many nights she endures, but by the quality of the final evidence she manages to transmit before being consumed, ensuring that the bright, cheerful facade of the second pizzeria is permanently stripped away for the next generation of unwitting employees. The inevitable clash between the withered and toy animatronics must serve a profound thematic purpose beyond mere spectacle. It should represent the failure of corporate attempts to whitewash true horror. When these two factions meet, perhaps the withereds, driven by raw, untethered spirit, stumble into the pristine performance area dominated by the toy line. The resulting chaos should be visually arresting but emotionally complex. The toy animatronics, designed for precise, non-violent customer interaction, might initially react to the aggressive, broken forms of the withereds, with system errors that manifest as high-pitched, panicked electronic shrieks, betraying their programmed limitations when confronted with genuine, uncontrolled spiritual entropy. Chloe, witnessing this mechanical melee, must grapple with the realization that she is simultaneously threatened by the past's victims and the present's highly efficient executioners. Her survival strategy pivots on whether she can exploit the withered's chaotic energy to temporarily disable the toy's superior surveillance network, or if the ensuing system overload simply traps her more securely within the building's collapsing infrastructure. Chloe's personal investment in exposing the truth must be underscored by a growing obsession with the mechanics of soul transference itself. Unlike Mike, who was reacting to direct threats, Chloe must actively pursue knowledge, drawn by a fierce need for logical closure. This could lead her to discover detailed, though heavily redacted, maintenance logs indicating that the animatronics' face-planting errors or sudden shutdowns are not mechanical failures, but moments where the imprisoned souls briefly exert enough force to momentarily halt the controlling circuits. She might find a log detailing a specific frequency pulse used during the original incident, realizing that Afton engineered the machinery to be temporarily susceptible to an emotional counter-frequency, perhaps one related to the sound of genuine, non-manufactured childhood laughter. This intellectual pursuit gives her agency, transforming her from a passive victim into an active investigator seeking the esoteric key to liberation. The depiction of the puppet should evolve to reflect the increasing stakes. If it is indeed guiding Chloe, its presence should feel less like a ghost and more like a severe, necessary system administrator. When Chloe is cornered, the lights might not fail entirely, but rather shift to a specific, limited spectrum, perhaps only green and red light remaining, the precise color palette associated with the puppet's original location within the game's lore. This selective illumination reveals hidden pathways or deactivated tripwires that the normal spectrum conceals, suggesting the puppet is filtering reality for Chloe, allowing her to see the spiritual infrastructure that underlies the physical horror. The emotion conveyed is one of profound shared burden. The puppet is eternally bound to this conflict and recognizes Chloe as the first living person capable of perceiving its efforts. The film's climax must transcend a simple escape sequence. If Chloe manages to transmit damning evidence, perhaps overriding the broadcast system, to show the withered animatronics in their state of perpetual torment over the pizzeria's main advertisement screens, her personal fate should remain tragically uncertain. Did she manage to escape before the toys finally cornered her in the server room, or did she sacrifice her escape for the truth? The lingering shot should focus not on the empty building, but on the moment the evidence floods the public sphere. The smiling face of Toy Freddy dissolving into the ravaged visage of withered Freddy on television screens across the city, signaling that the corporate deception has been violently exposed, regardless of the protagonist's personal outcome. This ensures the sequel achieves a thematic resonance beyond immediate thrills, framing the horror as a systemic, solvable problem, albeit one with devastating human casualties. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Watcher's Desk channel. If you're new here, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button to join our community. Today, we're diving into a discussion about the movie Five Nights at Freddy's 2, slated for release in 2025. The flickering fluorescent lights of the newly renovated Freddy Fazbear's Pizza hummed with an unsettling energy. Jeremy Fitzgerald, a young man whose previous employment history included a brief, ill-fated stint as a motivational speaker for a struggling network marketing firm, a venture that ended abruptly after an incident involving a trampoline and a very angry regional manager, took the night shift. He needed the money. His aspirations of becoming a concept artist for indie video games were currently being funded by instant ramen and sheer willpower. The pizzeria was different now. The old animatronics were gone, replaced by a new, shinier, and somehow even more terrifying lineup. There was Toy Freddy, whose plastic eyes seemed a fraction too wide, and Toy Bonnie, whose guitar playing, even in its dormant state, suggested a surprisingly complex understanding of minor chords. Then there was Mangle, a partially disassembled monstrosity hanging from the ceiling wires like a grotesque modern art installation, a testament, perhaps, to corporate cost-cutting measures gone horribly awry. The guardroom offered meager protection. Instead of traditional doors, Jeremy had access to a central security monitor and a mandatory flashlight. Crucially, he was given a complimentary Freddy Fazbear mask, a heavy fiberglass relic that was supposed to fool the older, more worn-out units, the withered ones, remnants of the previous location, who occasionally wandered in from the back rooms, their movements jerky and unnatural, like stop-motion figures brought to life by a vengeful spirit. The first few nights were a baptism by fire. The phone calls from the previous night guard, a character whose frantic, gasping instructions hinted at a long and traumatic history with these machines, were overwhelming. Jeremy learned quickly that the key was managing power. The flashlight burned through the limited battery supply, and the mask offered a temporary reprieve but consumed energy just by being worn. He remembered his college days, pulling all-nighters fueled by caffeine and adrenaline, desperately trying to meet deadlines for architectural design projects. This felt much worse. Less about a failing grade and more about imminent violent disassembly. The toy animatronics were relentless, driven by sophisticated movement algorithms. Toy Chica, whose appetite for maintenance seemed matched only by her appetite for destruction, would pace just outside the camera view, her yellow form occasionally catching the edge of the monitor. Jeremy found himself using the audio lure function, playing a pre-recorded jingle in a distant room, a desperate attempt to redirect their programmed focus, much like he used to distract his irritable landlord with poorly timed pizza deliveries. One particularly harrowing night, the older units made their move. Withered Foxy, surprisingly fast for something held together with exposed wires and sheer malice, rushed the left vent. Jeremy slammed the vent cover shut just as the metallic snout collided with the plastic, the impact rattling his teeth. He spared a moment to consider Foxy's original programming, a friendly pirate attraction, and how profoundly that purpose had been twisted into something predatory. The mystery deepened as the week progressed. Jeremy uncovered snippets of old maintenance logs suggesting that the new toy models weren't just new casings. They contained advanced facial recognition software designed to identify staff members specifically. This explained the chilling moment when Toy Bonnie had briefly paused, his head tilted, seemingly trying to place Jeremy's face. By the final shift, exhaustion was his constant companion. The power kept dipping dangerously low. Mangle dropped down from the ceiling unexpectedly, a chaotic tangle of wires and sharp edges, forcing Jeremy to scramble for the mask while simultaneously trying to reboot the ventilation system. When he finally donned the mask, the cold, hard plastic pressed against his face, and for a terrifying minute, the whirring and clicking ceased. He could hear only his own ragged breathing, mingling with the faint, high-pitched electronic whine emanating from the figure mere